When you think of Eminem, you probably picture that unhinged guy who terrified parents and politicians in the early 2000s. The man who put a target on absolutely everyone's back and made controversy his greatest weapon. Or you just think of him as arguably the greatest rapper to ever live. And the numbers definitely back that up. We're talking about an artist with 15 Grammys, an Academy Award, 11 consecutive #1 albums, and hundreds of millions of records sold worldwide. But this isn't a glamorous origin story. In fact, it's a messy one. It's a story of a guy who spent years trying to break into a music genre that met him with endless skepticism, if not outright hostility. A story of a broke dishwasher from Detroit, desperately trying to provide a better life for his newborn daughter. This is the story of Marshal Bruce Mathers III, and how the world came to know him as Eminem. Before there was Eminem, there was only Marshal Bruce Mathers III, and his early life was defined by a constant, chaotic instability. His dad walked out when he was just 18 months old, leaving his mother Debbie to raise him alone. But she struggled to hold down a job for more than a few months at a time, which meant they were always broke. They were constantly bouncing between public housing projects or crashing with different family members just to get by. He was always packing up, always moving, and always the new kid. And when you are always the scrawny new kid in a rough neighborhood, you become a target.
Beat up in bathroom, beat up in the hallways, shoved in the lockers, just for the most part, man, just being the new kid.
For Marshall, that meant enduring constant bullying. At one point, the bullying even escalated into a near-death experience. One of his bullies threw a snowball that hit him so hard, he went headfirst into a snowbank, suffering a cerebral hemorrhage. At just 9 years old, he spent 5 days lying in a hospital bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. When the physical world is that hostile, you have to find somewhere else to live. For Marshall, that escape route came from the one positive male figure in his life, his uncle Ronnie. Ronnie was actually just a few months older than him, so they were more like brothers than anything else. And one day, Ronnie handed him a cassette tape of the Breakin' soundtrack and played a track called Reckless by Ice-T. It was the very first hip-hop song Marshall had ever heard, and it completely flipped a switch in his brain. Hip-hop became something like an escape from a world that had given him very little to smile about. But he wasn't just some kid nodding along to the beat. He became completely obsessed with the mechanics of it. He would sit in his room for hours, flipping through the pages of a dictionary, memorizing obscure words and breaking down syllables. He wasn't doing very well in school, failing the 9th grade 3 times before officially dropping out. But he was building the skill that would eventually define him, word by word. In 1987, Marshall was 15 when he crossed paths with a 13-year-old girl named Kimberly Scott. Like Marshall, Kim was surviving a violently unstable family life. Things at Kim's house were so bad that shortly after they met, she and her twin sister actually ran away and literally moved in with Marshall and his mom. For a kid who had spent his entire life bouncing between housing projects as the outcast, being with Kim perhaps gave Marshall a sense of kinship, a sense of home. And so they started dating. It was the beginning of a relationship that would eventually give Marshall one of the most important anchors of his entire life. But we're getting ahead of the story. Because around the same time, Marshall met Deshaun Holton, or as most people knew him, Proof. The two connected almost instantly, both sharing the same passion for hip-hop. Proof was one of the few people who looked past the fact that Marshall was a skinny white kid in a predominantly black art form, judging him entirely on his actual talent. And not long after, he'd sneak Marshall into Osborne High School for lunchroom rap battles. He brought him not just into the competition, but into hip-hop culture itself. But more importantly, he would become a very dear friend in Marshall's life. Then he eventually dragged Marshall to the hip-hop shop on West 7 Mile every Saturday. It was ground zero for Detroit's underground hip-hop scene, the place where the city's best unsigned MCs came to prove themselves every week. And just to put this into perspective, these local battles were competitive and downright unforgiving. For any white kid in the 90s, walking into those rooms would take a different kind of courage. He would immediately get a side-eye for his looks and even hostility for even trying to get on stage. But what I didn't tell you was that Proof was one of the most respected figures in Detroit's underground hip-hop. And during all these, Proof vouched for him and forced the room to take him seriously. At one point, he even cleared everyone out of the shop except for about 10 people, and told Marshall to just rap and prove that he belonged in that room.
I'll clear everybody out. I'll have like 10 people, right? And you rap in front of them, and if they don't like you, they're gonna tell you they don't like you.
And just like that, he had the opportunity to turn that skepticism into respect, which he did. This local buzz gave him the confidence he needed to record and release his debut album, Infinite. Infinite was his first real bet on himself. And in a lot of ways, it was his first real shot at becoming the father he never had. You see, on Christmas Day in 1995, his relationship with Kim gave him the most important reason to make this work: the birth of their daughter, Haley. So, armed with his best friend in his corner, and the hard-earned respect he gained from battling in the Detroit underground hip-hop scene, he poured everything he had into recording that album. And to give himself the best shot at success, he shaped Infinite to sound more mainstream, modeled after the rappers who were actually getting airplay. Heck, he was even selling copies straight out of the trunk of his car. And mind you, he was doing all of this while working up to 60 hours a week, cooking and washing dishes for $5.50 an hour at a local restaurant. You'd think that kind of pure, raw hustle would be enough for Marshall's breakthrough. But the reality is, wanting it more than anyone else doesn't mean people are actually going to care. Local radio DJs refused to play it, and the few critics who did listen just brushed him off as a Nas clone. Now, personally, I think the album was actually pretty fire, but not many people shared that opinion back then. According to Eminem, Infinite sold maybe 70 copies. In other words, it was a commercial failure. At the time, he genuinely thought he was ready. Looking back, though, he admitted he was still trying to figure out exactly who he was and what he wanted to sound like. But while Marshall was still processing one blow, life was already loading the next one. Because only 5 days before Christmas, which also happened to be Haley's birthday, he was fired from his job at the restaurant. At the time, he only had $40 to his name. $40 to buy his daughter a present for her very first birthday. $40. That's all he had to show for all that grind. It was a painful realization that despite giving everything he had to give, he was still failing the one person he was doing all of this for. And if that wasn't enough, the crushing financial stress was tearing his home apart. He and Kim were in a constant state of turmoil, and at some point during all of this, she walked out, taking Haley with her. I can't imagine teetering on that kind of edge and feeling like there's no one there to pull you back. And I think at some point, that weight just became too much to carry. While recording a painfully raw track called Rock Bottom, Marshall found out that the supposed insider promising him a record deal actually just worked in the mailroom. Pushed to his absolute limit that night, he swallowed a massive amount of pills, intending for that track to be the last song he ever recorded. It's haunting to think his story almost ended that way, but thankfully, it didn't. He had very low tolerance for the pills and spent the rest of the night throwing up in the bathroom, and as devastating as hitting that rock bottom was, perhaps it was the exact catalyst he needed, because somewhere in that wreckage, Marshall stopped. He stopped trying to please everyone, stopped mimicking voices that were never his, or caring whether the world actually liked him. Instead, he took all his rage, his depression, and his twisted sense of humor, and channeled it into an alter ego, Slim Shady. Back in late 1996, Proof had this crazy idea. He wanted to form a rap group called D12, the Dirty Dozen. But since they only had 6 guys, Proof told everyone to come up with a dark, twisted, zero-filter alter ego to make up the other 6. The name Slim Shady literally hit him while sitting on the toilet. And he just knew there were a million words he could rhyme with it. And he didn't have to look very far for inspiration. Marshal's life was full of things for Slim to be mad about, and because the pain behind it was real, it turned what could have easily been a shock value gimmick into something uncomfortably real. It's wild when you think about it. If Infinite had actually been a massive success, maybe Slim Shady just remains a creative exercise that never leaves that bathroom. Or maybe D12 and his real-life pain made it inevitable anyway. I guess we'll never know. But what Marshall knew was that his next move had to be fundamentally different. So he poured all of that madness into a cassette tape, the Slim Shady EP. What came out was a high-pitched, unhinged, and darkly funny persona that was impossible to ignore. And while it didn't bring instant fame or record deals, it got people buzzing further than anything Infinite had ever managed. But recording a brilliant EP doesn't magically pay the rent. In fact, 1997 was actively trying to break him. That summer, Marshall traveled to Cincinnati for the Scribble Jam Rap Festival. He battled his way to the finals against a rapper named Juice, and lost. Back in Detroit, Marshall was practically invincible. This guy was the real deal, and Marshall got his first real taste of what losing felt like. And to this day, he still respects the guy for his talent. But that loss was just the start of a brutal downward spiral. He managed to secure a spot at the 1997 Rap Olympics in Los Angeles, desperately hoping to snag the $500 prize to give his life a little breathing room. But the night before his flight, Marshall came home to find he'd been evicted and his belongings sitting out on the lawn. Turns out the guy he'd been paying his rent to had just been pocketing the money the whole time. He was broke and had nowhere to go. So he broke back in through the back window, slept on the floor, got up the next morning, and boarded a plane to LA. And once he got into the event, he went all the way to the finals and faced off against a rapper named Otherwise. And in that final round, the guy pulled a bizarre theatrical stunt. Right when it was Marshall's turn to rap, instead of facing him directly, Otherwise simply walked away, leaving Marshall standing there with no one to rip apart. It sounds like an absurd move, but the hometown crowd completely ate it up. What made it sting even more, though, was that he didn't even feel the guy was on Juice's level. And yet, he lost anyway. By his own account, he felt super discouraged, and looking at everything he'd just been through, it's easy to see how he might have been ready to call it quits. So when a young guy named Dean Geislinger asked for a copy of his music, he thought nothing of it. He just sort of tossed him a cassette tape of the Slim Shady EP and just walked out. He didn't know it yet, but that casual handoff was about to change his life forever. When Marshall walked away from the Rap Olympics that night, his mind wasn't on that cassette tape. It was on the fact that he was going home with pretty much nothing. But Dean Geislinger wasn't a random kid. He was an intern at Interscope Records, and that tape landed on the desk of the label's founder, Jimmy Iovine. Jimmy popped it in, listened, and immediately knew he had to play it for one specific person: Dr. Dre. To Marshall, Dr. Dre was a foundational architect of hip-hop, someone whose work he had studied and admired for years. And that same Dr. Dre heard his EP was completely blown away and immediately demanded a meeting. The executives around him were heavily skeptical of signing an unknown, broke white kid from Detroit. But he didn't care what color Marshall was. If the talent was there, he was working with him, and he wasn't about to let this one slip away. When they met, Dr. Dre's first impression of Marshall was that,
I'm like, wow.
well, he looked ridiculous in a bright yellow sweatsuit. The music, though, that was a different story. Dre had put some samples together, worked something out on the drum machine, and just wanted to know what Marshall thought. According to Dre, maybe 2 or 3 seconds went when Marshall opened his mouth. And then that iconic hook was born in the very first few minutes of them ever working together. Dr. Dre was completely floored, and he just knew. Something special was happening in this session with a guy in a yellow sweatsuit. They ended up writing 4 entire tracks that day, and My Name Is became the breakthrough single that introduced Eminem to the world. Marshall had been rapping under the name Eminem since his earliest days in the Detroit battle scene. It started as M and M, just his initials, then written out phonetically to avoid infringing on a certain chocolate IP. And for years that name carried serious weight in the underground scene, earning him magazine features and freestyle awards. But to the mainstream world, he was still relatively unknown. In February 1999, the Slim Shady LP was released, and all of that changed. The album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200, sold over 280,000 copies in its first week, and eventually went quadruple platinum. His mainstream debut was funny, rude, ludicrous, and genuinely something new in the hip-hop world. And because of that heavy shock value, some critics actually wondered if he was going to be a one-hit wonder. Heck, he was even consistently demonized by both the media and politicians. But he was definitely not a one-hit wonder. And despite the endless outrage and an establishment actively rooting for his downfall, he thrived. Because from that point on, Marshall never stopped evolving. As it turns out, the Slim Shady LP didn't just put Eminem on the map. It became a stepping stone for a career that would ripple through the entire music world. And he just kept going. He set records no artist had ever achieved before him, earned more certified singles than any rapper in RIAA history, and sold mind-boggling numbers that most artists could only dream of. But ultimately, Marshall's greatest legacy wasn't the sales, the accolades, or the trophies he collected along the way. It was...
When I think about my accomplishments, that's probably the thing I'm the most proud of, is being able to raise kids.
Marshall Mathers had no father to guide him, no picture-perfect family, and experienced a lifetime of poverty and heartbreak. He was, in every sense, a flawed guy battling his own vices, inner demons, and deep insecurities, just like the rest of us. But what you come from doesn't have to define where you end up, because sometimes all the things that try to break you may end up being the very things that built you.
I'm a high school dropout, man, with a hip-hop education, and these were my teachers.